From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. You know, they say that the government that's closest to the people is the government that's the best. So that assumes automatically that we're talking about local government. And local government is literally where the rubber meets the road. Local government takes care of the streets, they fix the potholes, they pick up the garbage, they deliver the water, they take care of the dogs, and then they do important things like economic development and things like that too. So local government's a critical structure in government. The local government, by the nature of the Constitution of Montana and the configurations of government, is a creature of the state. The state is the sovereign entity under the federal Constitution, and the state empowers the local government to do what they can do or do what they can't, and tell them what they can't do. And that is usually in the hands of the legislature. So when the Constitution was being rewritten, when the Constitutional Convention was being called, and this is one of a series of programs in the Crucible of Change that is related to the Constitution, they took up local government as well. What should we do with local government? Should we make it more flexible? Should we give it more authority? Should we make them look at new ways of doing it, new structures? Those were the challenges that were facing the Constitutional Convention delegates. And in preparation for that, there were a lot of studies and a lot of things provided to them. We're going to talk about those today. We have a great group of panelists today to deal with local government and the Constitution and the implementation of the constitutional provisions by the legislature and the executive branch of state government. So that's what we're going to go into today, and we have a great group of folks here today. Mike Mikoni is here. Mike is the former mayor of Butte. He's a Butte native. Mike was elected mayor in 1969 as an independent, as a way to get elected in a crowded field. And once you got elected, you flipped back to your Democratic credentials and you were reelected twice again. And then a third time as the third time was, let's see, you were elected in 69, 71, 73. And then the consolidation of local government occurred, and you became the first ever chief executive of Butte Silverbow under the new form of government. Now, Mike, by the way, is from Butte, but Carroll College graduate, and later was in state government, as in the Department of Commerce, doing local government, community development work, little economic development work. Ultimately, you were head of the Department of Labor. Correct. Under Governor Stevens. You were under Governor Judge for a while, and you retired a number of years ago, and we're so happy you were able to come up here because you're in Henderson, Nevada now. We're so glad you were able to be here.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And Jerry Holloron. Jerry comes out of Corvallis, got his degree in journalism and was a writer for the lead newspapers with their state bureau. Right. When we first met way back when. And he moved from the state bureau to the Constitutional Convention staff. Right. And wrote the study on local government, and then when the actual Constitutional Convention occurred, you were the staffer for local government. And,
right.
And so we look at you to be the expert about what really came out of the Constitution. You then left and went to the UMJ school for quite a while, and then ended up writing back to newspaper work in Seattle-Tacoma area until you retired.
Right.
And thank you for coming all the way from the West Coast
Sure.
to this wonderful, warm and wet climate in Montana. No, we're so dry here, we can't even blow up the fireworks in Butte now. So, but thank you, and we're gonna, it's good to see you, and we've been on the phone quite a bit, but it's the first time we've seen each other in a lot of years. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you.
And Mike Shields. Mike's an Anaconda native, Carroll College again. So the Carroll was outnumbering us UM guys today, because after graduating from Carroll College, you were doing what you do in Montana when you haven't got any place to go when you graduated, and you went back and were working the summer at the smelter when you got a call from Dale Harris, who had moved from the Constitutional Convention to heading up the Local Government Commission under Governor Judge's office.
That's right.
And they were the implementers, if you will. And so all of a sudden you went to work for a couple of years implementing and doing it mostly in eastern Montana. But you have a distinguished career beyond that. You went to work with Senator Baucus for 4 years in D.C. You came back and got a master's at UM. You worked for Lieutenant Governor Turman for what was it, 6 years?
Right.
And he was in charge of local government for the Schwinden administration, essentially, because he was a former mayor from Missoula. Yeah. And then you went back to D.C., worked for Environment and Public Works, and then the EPA until you just retired last year. And what happens? You came back to Montana?
That's right.
It has a great draw. You know, it's really interesting. You guys are really wonderful examples of the strength we have in Montana, which is great people who are drawn to public service. It's really something that we wonder about these days when people demonize public service and demonize government, that in fact real talent comes into government and makes a difference. And so thank you for joining us. I want to start with you, Jerry, because we want to talk about the Constitution, about the elements of the Constitution, the things that were the problems with local government, the opportunities with local government, and what the convention committee ended up doing and kind of how it played out at the convention. If you want to just give us a little primer on what you guys ended up doing.
I think that when you think back at the 1889 Constitution, which is the one that the new Constitution replaced.
Clark's Constitution.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
It was about twice as long, the local government article, as the new Constitution was. And it also dwelt on counties, pretty much. Cities were hardly even mentioned. And with such things as the location of county seats, very specific on county formation. So the needs had changed greatly in terms of the Constitution, what a Constitution should say on local government.
Well, I might say that for our viewers, that at the time of that Constitution, there weren't a lot of counties in Montana.
Right.
There were just great big areas. And then later there were 20, 25 counties.
Right.
And this 56 county thing actually happened in the 30s, I believe.
Right, the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing is that many of the counties today, of the 56 counties, and certainly this was true in the 1970s too, when the new Constitution was written. Many of the counties today and then have fewer residents than they did in 1920. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about growth, and we think of growth all the time in terms of getting bigger. In Montana, in terms of the governments, much of what's happened is that the counties now have fewer people than when they were first formed. So you have a whole range of different problems that I'm not sure are being particularly effectively addressed.
You know, it's interesting that I often would tell people when they'd ask about Montana, and I'd say, well, you know, the movement of people have been from rural to urban,
Exactly.
from east to west, although that's changed a little bit with the Bakken situation now, and from Butte to out of state, because we were such a big area that mining people often went out of state to find a job. But you're right about that, but there was a heavy emphasis on counties. I interrupted.
And there was a lot of the language really had to do with, without directly saying what powers cities and counties should have, kind of creating a framework. And the framework that was created was that, as in many other states, that the local governments could do only what the legislature had specifically said they could do. In other words, if a city wanted to collect revenue from garbage collection, for example, there would have to be a state law authorizing that to happen. It was even worse for counties. For counties, not only did the legislature have to authorize them to do it, it would have to spell out exactly how they could do it. So they were even more tightly bound than were cities. The impetus, I think, from local government for new provisions really came from counties and cities that were really sort of fed up, in a sense, with the legislature over the years because they depended so much on the legislature to authorize them to do things. And the legislature, arguably, I think, was very reluctant to authorize cities and counties to do anything.
So cities and counties were envisioning a form of maybe possible freedom, a little more freedom.
I think very definitely they were, and I think they were envisioning ways to get more money, and a problem that I don't think the Constitution has changed.
You were practicing in the counties back then, in the city.
Yeah, and what Jerry says is correct. We in local government almost at times felt as though we were going to the legislators and begging them to allow us to do things that were important, things that our residents wanted. And the legislature really couldn't understand what we were getting at. Or else they just said, we don't want to be bothered with those guys, so let's just get rid of them.
Well, while we're kind of generally in this discussion of this, I think I often think about, because local government still is kind of the stepchild, and maybe there's a different word before stepchild, of the legislature. And they still are constrained a lot by the legislature, though less so than they were, but they're still constrained a lot. And the attitude of the legislators is that they don't trust local government officials.
Oh, no.
And so it's a great irony that the electorate is enlightened when they vote for a legislator, but they apparently don't know what they're doing when they the same voters vote for local government. So that's kind of, I guess that's just the real world we operate in too. So that was what you saw in 1889, was that kind of focus, the old Constitution. And when you did that big study that you did to try to open the doors and open the eyes up for CONCON delegates, what did you see as the kind of things that needed to be done?
I think one of the main areas was to attempt to clarify what power local governments had. The 1889 Constitution handled the matter with silence, pretty much. And which was later interpreted as meaning that cities and counties could do only, as I said, what the legislature had specifically told them they could do, would authorize. And so I think the delegates wanted to address that question. I think there was a general feeling among the delegates that the legislature had not been as free with local governments as it should have been. In other words, had not authorized them to do enough. So I think there was a sense of needing to get away from that allocation of power question, try to solve that somehow, or at least address it. And there was a similar effort in terms of the structure of local government. The legislature before the new Constitution, the legislature under the old one, old Constitution, had authorized some alternative forms of government, but there weren't that many of them. There weren't that many alternatives offered. There weren't that many that had been adopted. And there was a real sense, I think, that to come up with some sort of constitutional language that would give flexibility. And I think if there's a word that can sum up what the framers of the 1972 Constitution attempted to do, was to give local governments flexibility. And part of the way of doing that is to simply clean out a lot of the undergrowth of the old Constitution. Mm-hmm. As I said, the local government article in the new Constitution, the 1972 Constitution, is, I think, less than half as long mm-hmm. as the provisions in the old 1889 Constitution. And a lot of those changes were designed to attempt to directly give some flexibility to local governments. The extent to which you can directly give that flexibility without the legislature mm-hmm. Interfering or having a direct say is arguable. Maybe the legislature should run local governments. My personal view is they shouldn't, but maybe they should.
Well, the CON actually, and I think the net result of this thing was that they delineated a whole bunch of flexibility possibilities.
Right.
But it still was kind of filtered through the legislative process to get it implemented.
Right.
Which then created some constraints, I think, on the same. So some of the flexibility never happened because the legislature didn't give a lot of flexibility when they had the option.
The premise was always, as Jerry and Mike have described, was referred to as Dillon's rule. And it didn't refer to Dillon in Beaverhead County, but it was a court case in Kansas in the early 20th century. And it was basically local governments could do only what they were prescribed to do or allowed to do. So there was an effort to broaden that, give them more latitude to deal with it. The legislature, in some ways, continued to be reluctant to do that, but they did provide some options in the form of charters and self-governing powers, trying to adapt the form of government to reflect the changes of the late 20th century, things that weren't even considered in 1889. And so that was basically the impetus for the title that came out of the Constitutional Convention. And then subsequently, the enabling legislation passed by the legislature created the State Commission on Local Government. And the commission was a gubernatorial commission, was chaired by Harold Gerke, who was then Speaker of the House.
But also had been a former mayor of Billings, correct?
Most of the folks on the commission had some tie to local government. Mm-hmm. Longtime legislator from Helena, Glenn Drake, was the co-chairman. And they set about implementing the legislation that the legislature had passed. You had the 56 counties and 126 cities and towns who were required to create these study commissions. And the commission implemented that. There was a good deal of research done, primarily by the Bureau of Government Research at Missoula and at Montana State. Lauren McKinsey at Bozeman, Jim Lopatch and Peter Cohen at Missoula did a lot of the background information for the study commissioners. In addition, the commission had, which I think is sometimes missed, but it was a large piece of the agenda, and that was the local government code was voluminous, very prescriptive. And what the commission tried to do was a recodification of all the local government statutes. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, put on the table state assumption of some of the services, courts, welfare. That was all included in an enabling bill, House Bill 122. And the wrap on 122 was it was over 700 pages. And
light reading.
And one legislator said, I haven't read 700 pages in my life and I'm not going to start now. The bill was introduced with a good deal of fanfare, but was really unsuccessful. I'm happy to say that portions of it were enacted in later sessions, but that was the process, and that was, they were trying to come to grips with the fact that local governments were confronting serious problems, and the form of government and the powers of government were, ill-equipped to deal with them. And in many ways, we're dealing with them now. The counties in the Bakken, exponential growth, inability to deal with infrastructure, caps on bonding, caps on taxation, and as a consequence, they're back before the legislature attempting to deal with it.
Now, the flexibility that you were on the commission staff trying to provide some guidance to local governments on as they reviewed their own structure, those were things that were in many cases articulated by the Constitution, right? The charter, self-governing, those issues were came out of the committee, did they?
Yeah, sort of. Before the convention, local governments, again, could do only what the legislature said they could do, and they had to have a structure that had been already approved by the legislature. That could be a city manager, it could be a city council, but it had to be, the structure was set by the legislature.
Specifically by the legislature.
Right.
Yeah.
The new Constitution allowed that, and in fact, again, kind of tried to shove the legislature into approving even more potential forms of government, but it also provided for self-government powers and self-government structure in which a local government could write its own charter. In other words, it added, the 1972 Constitution added the provision where voters in a city or county could write their own form of government, design their own form of government, which had not been allowed before.
It is very interesting that part of the theme of this whole series is about the change when the copper collar was removed from Montana, when essentially economic and political control was pretty much absolute with the Anaconda Company, not without a lot of fighting, but still they always seemed to prevail. And that through the Constitution and the election of certain kinds of leadership and reorganizing the executive branch and modernizing the legislative branch, that essentially, in passing a lot of interesting laws in the early parts of the 70s, that there was a shift in power away from the old power of the Anaconda Company and its buddies, corporate and powerful organizational buddies, to the people. And essentially, that's what we're talking about here, was choices were given to people,
Right.
which heretofore were totally subject of legislative control, and the legislature seemed much more controlled by the lobbyists for certain entities than perhaps by the people. So that's an overall thrust of this whole series, and this seems to be part of that. However, whether or not it came to complete fruition is a challenge. And one of the things about the legislative constriction on local government, which is at least partially lifted by the Constitution, may have had to do with the fact that the Constitution, the convention itself, could not have any active legislators be members. Supreme Court ruled,
Right.
you're an active now there were some former legislators there, but if you were an active legislator, you could not run for the Constitution. In fact, there was some great consternation in the halls of Helena when that decision came out, as I recall.
Yes. Great.
Because the legislators said, we want to be there because we know what's best.
Right.
We know what's right. Do you remember that, Mike?
I do. It's always the case that, particularly when someone is in office for a number of years, that they always know what's best for the people. The people really don't know what's best for themselves. It's we who are educated in the system that know best, and we see that in local government also. And but with the legislature, it was quite evident that they were perturbed that no legislators could run.
Well, you'll trust the people if ultimately that's what you end up doing in a democracy.
Right.
And if the people have open choices. Now that you talked about the charter, self-governing possibilities, what about consolidation?
Actually, the 1889 Constitution allowed city-county consolidation, and through an amendment, it allowed it. The new Constitution allowed two things. One is for the legislature to design systems of local government that would allow for consolidation, which is what the 1889 Constitution also did. But it also allowed cities and counties to design their own form of local government and combine with a vote of the people. And that had not been allowed in Montana before. Self-government charters is what the Montana Constitution now calls them. So that's what it allowed. I think there was an assumption that more counties and cities in going through the local government review process would move toward that. Towards city-county consolidation. That really didn't happen.
Well, we're going to talk about the two cases of consolidation that actually occurred and maybe a couple that failed in a few moments, but can you take off a little bit on the review? Because it seems to me that the Constitution mandated people involvement through this review process. Can you?
It did, and I think that was probably the main unique local government feature of the Montana Constitution that, to my knowledge, no other state had approached it this way, was to require that, I think it was within, 2 years of adoption of the Constitution, every city and town and county in the state would have to review their form of local government. And that was to be done through a local commission, which was elected by the people, to independently decide in Culbertson, and I think that's incorporated, in Darby, in Missoula, in Billings, and in counties, to look at their form of local government and decide whether they wanted to keep it or wanted to change it. And also it provided in the Constitution that every 10 years, as clarified through amendment, every 10 years the Montana residents of a specific county or city would have to vote on whether they wanted to review it again. But the first time around, they had to set up a local government study commission.
And they have to have the option every 10 years.
Yes.
And people can opt. No, well, for example, I know in Butte, they did every 10 years they had a commission. And then this recently, 2 years ago, they had a vote and said, no, we're not even going to bother looking at it this time.
Right.
So, but the choice was there. Now you were, when that first 2 years, when all these local governments were reviewing themselves, that's when you were out there doing your job.
Part of the staff for the Local Government Commission, we did a good deal of outreach. You had 642 study commissioners across the state. And I think
now those are, each local government had a study commission, so you add up them all together, there were 642?
642 individuals were involved in the process. And, you know, a lot of the major cities, Missoula, Billings, Butte, you know, they started from day one and basically grabbed the ball and ran with it. A lot of them were rural places. The impetus, or the state commission, knew that they would need help, need assistance, not from the standpoint of trying to prejudice it one way or the other, but just to inform them as to, here are the options, here's how you go about writing a charter, how you propose it on the ballot, that type of thing. So 3 of us were designated to, you know, assist those study commissioners or study commissions with that task. And I think it's important to remember the context. It was right around the bicentennial. So there was an attempt, I think, to, you know, take advantage of the civic process with the bicentennial and try to encourage people to get involved and take a look at it. And I think, you know, the intent of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, was really fulfilled in that you had this group of people who really had not been involved in government before, in most cases, took the task fairly seriously. And I think that's evident in the fact that the commissions, the actual commissions, did propose some major changes in their form of government, in the powers of those local governments. The voters saw it differently. The vast majority of the charters went down to defeat. There were instances where areas proposed unification and consolidation of city and county governments. They were successful in 2 instances, and I think it's indicative. The 2 smallest counties geographically did it, and primarily dominated by one major city. So I think it made the task there much more logical and more palatable to the electorate. The other interesting thing was most of the success of the local charters and changes that were made were done at either the primary election or in special elections during the course of '76, which tended to mean voter turnout tended to be lower. And as a consequence, I think most of the people who had an interest in seeing the change were motivated to go to the polls. Those proposals that were part of the general election, and it was a presidential election year, so turnout was relatively high, tended to go down. So,
yeah. That's not uncommon.
No.
That's not uncommon. In fact, the election to the Constitutional Commission delegates was done at a special election, and the vote to approve it occurred at a primary election, which again constrained the turnout. Well, it is interesting now. All those people now. Would you say that maybe looking at 122 and it was a big bill that didn't make it, or looking at the implementation of these review commissions, that there'd been a lot of big changes going on, and maybe folks were saying maybe enough's enough or something? I mean, I'm asking, that's an evaluation I'm asking you about. But
I think there's credibility to that from the standpoint of just you know, you'd had the con, you'd done executive reorganization. This was the 70s. There's a good deal of turmoil nationally. And by the time the local government review process came about, a lot of that impetus may have dissipated. But another way of looking at it is perhaps voters, local residents, saw no need for change, that they were content with the type of government that they had. So,
yeah, you mentioned that those charters that went up in the general election, for the most part, were defeated. But I believe Butte Silver Bow and Anaconda Deer Lodge both came up in the general election.
all right.
And our charter in Butte Silver Bow passed fairly, not landslide by any means, but by a significant number of votes.
Right.
So,
But you had a product of a commission, and you as mayor were strongly supportive of that consolidation.
I was.
Often mayors will say, wait a minute, I don't know, or county commissioners say, I don't know. What happened with your county commissioners? Were they on board, or were they?
Well, it was difficult to get the county commission at the time even to join with the city of Butte to unify the study commission. We didn't want, there were 9 elected from the county, there were 5 elected from the city. We didn't want those two bodies meeting separately and coming up with different
things,
ideas. One come up with consolidation and the other come up with the city of Butte disenfranchising or something. So it was difficult to get them to even to agree to unification of this committee. But we were able to get that done, and from that point on, they stepped aside and were not involved. The city of Walkerville, which had the option, and it was their prerogative to opt out, they took that approach of we didn't want to be involved in the joint study commission, so they did their own review. So we embarked.
So you have a consolidated government was put on the ballot, but came out that since the commission met together, they came up with a recommendation. Is that it right there, or what?
Yeah, this is the original, or this was a charter that was submitted to the two governments and to the people of Butte Silver Bow. And as you can see, it's a pretty thin document. But I have to say, they did a tremendous job in covering all the bases. Even the base that the people of Butte love to elect their officials. They don't care for that much for appointed officials. And so when consolidation came before the voters in the early 30s, the only thing it called for was a commission and an appointed manager to oversee the government. Well, they were not about to turn that much authority over to an appointed official, so they turned it down. It came before the voters again in 1963, the same form of government, and it was turned down. So I believe the 72 Constitution really provided Butte with the opportunity to look at, and we didn't talk about consolidation, we talked about unification. And unification to us meant being able to sit down, our residents writing our own charter, having the self-government powers that the legislature had granted to those cities that had a charter, and allow our residents to make that decision. And so the vote of the Constitution just opened the door for us to move forward, because it was certainly obvious to me in my first 2 years of office that if we didn't unify with Silver Bow County, we were going to be in dire financial straits and go bankrupt. And we certainly didn't want that to happen. So we embarked on it, and Our study commission was created of, it was made up of business people, professionals, firefighters from the volunteer fire departments, I think also from the paid fire department, housewives, retired people, and they elected as their chair, Dr. Robert Tromitz, who did a tremendous
Very
job in
respected
holding
position, yeah.
holding that committee together. And so their charter was presented, I can say with some difficulty on my part, on what they put into that charter, because being a mayor and being in charge of all of the departments in the city and appointing those department heads, found it a little difficult to understand how we were going to operate a government that had 12 elected officials. And we had all of the traditional county departments being elected. On top of that, the charter provided for the appointment of a public works director. Public works director in charge of all the parks, road work, anything that had the physical nature of improving the city. Now, let me tell you, I finally acquiesced because our study commission decided that they wanted to get unification passed under almost
You could tweak it later, but let's get it done.
Yeah, we can tweak it later. And they're still, I think...
Tweaking
I
is
think
still
they're
needed sometimes.
I think they're still tweaking. But I thought the interesting item in the charter talked in terms of the powers of the executive.
Keeping in mind that the executive, you would think, would be empowered to execute everything, get it done.
Not only that, but the executive was responsible for it.
Right.
So
after Forrest had gotten that done through the state government, although there were a lot of elected officials retained, but still substantially he was able to consolidate all that at the state level.
Yeah,
What did
we
you
had
guys do?
we had 12 departments, 10 departments. I'm sorry. 12 elected officials would have included the judiciary. But the final thing they put in the powers of the chief executive. The chief executive shall be responsible for coordinating policies of the Council of Commissioners, which a mayor does that with the city council anyhow, and with all elected and appointed department heads. In other words, it was the chief executive's responsibility to make sure that all the elected officials were living within the policies that our Council of Commissioners created and that the chief executive created. Now, let me tell you, that is an awful difficult situation because at times it can come down to, how many votes did you get in the election? Well, I got 10,000. Well, I'm sorry, I got 12,000, so I got more votes than you.
Yeah, so what are you doing
So
trying
that's
to
the
tell
type
me
of
what
thing
to
you
do?
run into. And of course,
Yeah.
as you know, all elected officials have a certain amount of ego and pride. And so for the first 2 years of the consolidation were somewhat trying because I spent my time working not only with the Council of Commissioners to create policies that were going to be workable and good for our residents, but also working with the department heads who had their own agendas to try to get them to understand that the legislative body is going to set the policies, not the executive branch, and you belong to the executive branch. So it was a difficult time, but it made progress. And I think today we can say that those elected officials are working, as far to my knowledge, hand in hand with the council and the chief executive.
I think it's an interesting reflection that the elected officials being retained by you guys in Butte at the local level when you were making a choice. You thought politically, let's not get rid of these elected officials that might endanger the charter, because people want to vote for the same thing occurred in the Constitution itself, where most of the state level elected officials were retained, and part of the reason was the very same thing. If we take away a bunch of these positions, we might lose the Constitution, and in the case of the Constitution, it was a pretty close vote.
Right. In the 1889 Constitution provided a long list of officials that each county had to elect. And one of the main things I think that the Constitutional Convention Committee, Local Government Committee, had to decide was whether to name in the Constitution all those elected officials again.
Which locks them in.
Right. And what the delegates did was to say that required the legislature to provide for alternative forms of government, and say that one of the alternative forms of government had to include that long list of elected officials, thinking that then it would just become one of a number of options.
Kind of splitting the baby, so to speak, you know, to try to get the votes.
Of course, what happened is that in votive review of local government in each county and city, almost all of them voted in favor of keeping the former government they had, which includes the long list. But I should mention that the new Constitution is not new now. It's what, 50 years old?
43 years old. Yeah.
It's new to me. That the Constitution also gives pretty broad power to the county commissioners now to combine those offices if they want to. For example, the Lewis and Clark County Commission, if it wanted to, could combine a number of the now elected officials. I don't know to what extent that's been used, but it is possible. Again, as an example, I think of the Constitutional Convention delegates trying to give the flexibility to local governments. I'm not sure to what extent the local governments have used that flexibility.
But as we've talked about the people being empowered, you can make a textbook case for all kinds of efficiencies in government and everything else. And if the price of that textbook case is you don't get to have as many elections, people were kind of saying, no, we like those little elections, even if it may not be efficient.
I'm not sure that voters, and I think this is fine. I'm not sure the voters want, really, when it comes down to it, that much efficiency. Things may run more smoothly that way, but you lose something in terms of democracy, I think, and to some extent, I guess, you know, if they want to elect the long list of officials,
right?
Fine.
How did that work out? Now, wasn't there a study done by Professor Lopatch and those guys after it was all this effort at local review? What did that? And you were working on the front end of it. What happened?
Well, as defined by Lopatch and Curran, 71% of the counties proposed major change, and I believe major change included opting for self-governing powers. The cities, 53% of the commissions proposed major change. In reality, the voters turned most of those down. So what you had is those who had taken the time over a course of 2 years to study the forms of government and everything, gone through a hearing process. There were hearings that were mandated by the legislature for the commissions. They couldn't go and close themselves up in a room and propose something. They had to have a public vetting process.
Yeah, and I think it's important as far as Butte is concerned. We had the media at the study commission had the media at every one of their meetings. And so they were able to give both sides of the story. And I guess whoever was the dominant one on that particular issue that night, it registered with the voters, and at least for a short period of time.
Well, maybe it's fair to say that the ability to consolidate and to review and to make the changes that Butte and Anaconda both did provided an opportunity at a time when change appeared to be to the electorate necessary for survival.
I think that's probably true. And
because you guys were, Butte was being so economically challenged with the changes with the Anaconda Company we're going through, that everyone could see happening, that plus maybe a little bit of messing around in some of the local government, not the city under you, but...
I think Anaconda and Butte, you're correct, recognize that if we're going to survive in the future, we've got to make a drastic change. In the Butte experience, we were able to convince the people of the fact that this change was really necessary, because our voters, I think we had something like 75% turnout for to vote on the charter, which is a phenomenal number. Right. But it showed that the people were interested. They were reading the news articles that were written every time the study commission met. And by the way, that study commission we had were meeting almost on a weekly basis for 2 years. And when they finally wrote their report, I'm sure there was a huge sigh of relief on the part of 14 individuals.
Yeah. How did I get into this? Well, you know, but again, the call to public service for those 642 people was very important to Montana, and the reflections of the voters ultimately casting their decisions on it. I guess that's what democracy is all about. But it's very interesting that you said, Jerry, that you thought perhaps this local government review may be unique to Montana as a constitutional provision.
Right. It was at the time it was adopted.
Maybe people copied it.
Whether in the last 45, 50 years other states have adopted it, I'm not sure. But I do. I feel that, I'm not sure that the delegates would feel this way. I think some of them would. That just the fact of requiring people to have the local commissions, whether the results are approved or not by the voters, is probably worth it. I don't think the fact that so many of the proposals failed at the polls, almost all of them, is a sign that the process didn't work. I think you can argue that it's a sign that the process didn't work.
Well, the voters
people
at some
wanted
point
to keep what they had.
Yeah, the voters essentially said, let's keep what we have, we're happy with it.
Exactly.
That's a decision of the people.
Right.
And certainly change isn't automatically required. But
yeah, and I know of, back in my time as mayor, there were a couple of areas that consolidated, like down Dade County in Florida, they consolidated. And I believe in Indianapolis, they consolidated. But it was done by the legislature. Right. They just went to the legislature and said, we want to consolidate the city and county, and the legislature said, okay. I think the people of Montana have shown there's a better way to do it. Now, we may not always agree with officials that say we want to unify issues or we want to do away with this, but at least they have had their voice. And that, as far as liberty in our country, that's the greatest liberty we can have, is to express.
Well, we're getting, we're not at the end here, but we're getting closer to the end of this program. The hour always goes so fast. I want to ask each one of you to kind of personally reflect upon this time and your participation in it, Jerry. What your involvement in the Constitution, What did that mean to you? What are your kind of reflections on it
Oh,
personally?
It's strange to look back at it now because I think of all this as happening yesterday, but it happened 50 years ago. I think the main thing that I still haven't figured out was what it was that happened during that era of the late 60s and at least the first half of the 70s, in which Montana really was pretty progressive about the number of changes. Yeah. Not just the Constitution, although it probably was the main one. And I don't really know what happened. I don't know why it happened. I'm not sure whether it was the same force behind all the changes or not.
We, again, the subtitle of this series is, you know, in the Crucible of Change, right. Montana's dramatic period of progressive change. And right. It wasn't just change, but it was progressive change. Right. And you're saying, you walked away saying, I don't know, it sure happened, but I'm not sure why.
Exactly. And one of the, you started out in the program, I think, mentioning this too, that one thing I personally am very proud about is the fact that the convention staff had, what, 12 or 13, I guess, right. people doing research on it. And all of them, if my recollection is right, all of them were from Montana.
Yeah.
This wasn't a matter of going out of state and hiring people to come in and do this. It was Montana people who did this.
Yeah. Mike, your reflections on this period real quickly, and then.
Well, I think the people of Montana were very enlightened and smart to pass the new Constitution. My time in involvement with changing the charter in Butte, probably one of the things that I remember most about my administration, the 10 years I spent there. Mm-hmm. So that Constitution gave us that opportunity, and the city of Butte is very thankful for it.
And Butte made more of it than almost anybody. Mike, what are your thoughts about
I think just the fact that we had a civic process that brought together local folks to look at the functions of their government. I think they came away with a better appreciation of what the constraints are on a mayor. I don't think initially people really realized the legislative presence was so dominant, and I think through the process people appreciated the fact that there were limitations on local officials that they may not have been aware of at the beginning of the process.
Well, you know, our time is just about up, and I want to say that it's been such a pleasure to have all three of you here, because you are the real experts about what went on and what, in terms of the creation of a possibility of change, the implementation of the possibility, actually doing it. These are things that make a difference to folks. We want them to look back on that period and see local government and how it was affected. So your coming and joining us today has been a big, important part of this message. And so for those of you that are with us every week, we want to tell you we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.